He's Howard Eibach, a former copywriter and creative director and the author of 2 books on the creative brief.
And he's Henry Gomez, an ad agency strategist with over 27 years of experience. Together, he and I are the Brief Brothers. We love talking about creative briefs, briefing, and advertising. We're back for another episode, Henry, and today I'm going to take advantage of having been tagged on LinkedIn by a former student of mine who clued me into a discussion by some creatives. And let me just show you the post. And it is the basis for our topic today, which essentially is, what is the role of creatives in not just the creative brief, but what the creative brief is meant to ask of us? So let me just show you what I came across. This is the post that my young friend Harrison Gibbons tagged me on. It's stuff about advertising. There are a number of followers, and there are some creatives who are involved in this particular or this group. And on this post, it says creatives love to complain about creative briefs. And here are a list of things that this particular poster wanted to complain about. Well, first of all, I think this is great that creatives are speaking up, stepping up and speaking up about the creative brief and speaking what they think needs to be done and to make the briefs better. That's awesome. That's important. But as I was reading through the points that this particular creator was making, I stopped on this one here. It says, tell me the deliverables first. The super detailed list of deliverables can come later in the brief, but I want some context before we dive into the information. Without that setup, I'm going to be thinking about videos and out-of-home ideas as you're going through the brief. And then at the end, you'll tell me we're doing only one social post. All right, that's an interesting point. But I think on a larger point, this is something that I think is very predictable. When I do my workshops and I show examples of great briefs, I show the Hulu brief that you wrote, that we did together, but you wrote it for a series of episodes we did last year. And I show the Kiwi brief, and I show a bunch of other briefs, and I set these up as being examples of great briefs. And what they have in common is none of them list deliverables, not one. Sometimes they'll say, we just want the big idea. The Hulu brief said, we want a whole brand campaign, and that sometimes intimates what the deliverables are. But my argument is this, and it comes down to 4 words: idea first, tactic second. Now, there is an exception to that, but let me just make my point. It's not only the creative's responsibility to be part of the brief and to contribute to the brief so that it's not a surprise during the creative briefing, but the creative should go further and say, let me come up with an idea, and then I can recommend some best tactics that will go with this idea. Now, sometimes, as I said, there's an exception. If we do a lot of above-the-line advertising, media has to be purchased in advance. If you do a lot of TV, if you do paid digital, sometimes you got to buy that well in advance and you don't have any control over that. But that does not mean that there are other things that a creative can recommend that the tactic reflects the idea. So my argument here is creatives need to take a more active role in deciding what could be a great tactic for the idea they come up with. Don't wait for those tactics to be presented to you. Don't allow them to just be presented to you. Get involved and make a recommendation. And I think that'll have a huge impact on the outcome of the campaign. What do you think, Henry?
I think you're wrong. No, I'm just kidding. I think every situation is different. Okay. When we did the Hulu brief, we were looking at it as if it were a pitch. Mm-hmm. And when you have a pitch, things are much more wide open. I mean, you mentioned the example of when media is bought in advance. That's not just a sometimes example. That's the majority of the time. When you're working actively with a client from year to year, the media choices have been determined before even the strategist sits down to write the brief for the assignment. So some of those pieces of the puzzle have already been put in place. So, if the client needs 6-second, pre-roll videos for YouTube because that's what they bought, I got to tell the creatives that's what we're doing. Otherwise, they're going to spend time coming up with stuff that isn't part of the plan. That doesn't mean that if they come up with something that isn't a 6-second video, that they can't present that in addition to doing what we call the homework, right? Which what we were assigned to do, the 6-second video in this example, doesn't mean that they can't come up with something else. But the truth is, a lot of times we know already what we're going to have to do. To me, the interesting thing about this post is, and you kind of glossed over it, that the post assumes that there's going to be deliverables on the brief. What's interesting about it is that they're saying psychologically it's better to say what those deliverables are up front, so that as I'm listening to the brief and digesting the brief, I'm doing it in the context of what those deliverables are going to be, so that it's not a detour at the end. It's like, oh yeah, but you got to do all that in a 6-second video.
Well, hang
And
on, Henry. Hang on though. Say if creatives are doing what you do with your creatives, which is to advise them in advance, that shouldn't be a surprise. That shouldn't be announced at the kickoff. That should be known in advance.
well,
And that's
but
what I think.
but I share my brief with the creative director, or someone the creative director appoints to be his lieutenant on this assignment. I don't share it with the entire team of creative. Some of our assignments, our whole creative department is going to work on. And I don't share and I get input on my brief from 14 people. I get
I understand.
I get the feedback from the creative director, or the person he assigns, or sometimes both. So the point is, I think, and I had never thought of this, and so I give the author of this credit. I never thought of, as the recipient of the brief, when there is already kind of an expected deliverable because the client has bought it, or sometimes you have a brand idea and that idea already exists. You just need new tactics to execute it in, and we know what those are going to be. I think the interesting thing here is the psychology of a creative, as they're taking in the briefing information, changes when they know what they need to create towards, rather than leaving it to the end of the brief, especially in my case, because I present the briefs sequentially on a PowerPoint, so that they don't go right to the single-minded proposition and start thinking before I can kind of unveil the story. So I think at least hinting toward what the specific deliverables are going to be could help. And I this is actually something that made me think. It made me kind of change my mind a little bit. But I just think that for cases where we don't know what the deliverables are going to be, tend to be fewer than cases where we do know as an agency what the deliverables are going to be. In a pitch situation, the client briefs us and says, we want a totally new brand campaign, which signifies a new idea. Those things kind of have a lot fewer constraints, right? And so the message can dictate the medium sometimes. But there's also the other part of it, which is the target dictates the medium, right? Like reaching wealthy boomers, you might still buy a newspaper, where reaching 18 to 24-year-olds, you would never buy a newspaper. So
Right.
I think all of those things kind of have to come together in terms of making media recommendations, and knowing, like, okay, what specific units we're going to buy in those. Because even, for example, let's say we go back 30 years when newspapers were really still a big thing. It's one thing to say we're going to have a full page, and it's another thing to say we're going to have a business card ad, right? Like, how you treat that creatively. And that doesn't mean that a business card ad is inferior to, you could do something super creative with a business card size ad, but it's going to be tailored to that medium, because we know we can only afford that, or we're going to buy a series of these business card ads, size ads. So I don't know. I think it's a good provocation is a word I hear a lot lately in strategist circles, and it's a good word. I'm not big on jargon and industry jargon, but I think as a strategist, a lot of times provocations are good because they make you think. And I think that this one was a good provocation.
Yeah, and you know, I did a recent training, and you know, for a very large brand that you'd recognize when I was doing some training for the ANA. And I brought up this point in the conversation, and I was told, to my surprise, that their creative department plays a huge role in deciding what the deliverables are going to be in advance, which is not common. Uh, in other words, the decision about what the deliverables are is not baked into the to each assignment. There's a lot of, in other words, they don't do as much above the line kind of advertising. It's more digital, so there are some, you know, advanced purchases that they have to make, but there's a lot of other options that they have. So I was falling into my own bias, I had to admit, expecting them to tell me that they don't have that they wait for the deliverables to be announced to them. And they said, no, 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 we have a huge role. Our creatives have a huge role in deciding what those deliverables are. So call me a
I,
purist, call me, you know, maybe I'm not as plugged into the world today as it is. I still think the creative should play a larger role in deciding what those deliverables are, where there are more opportunities to do that.
I think that there's each client is different, right? Like, so
Mhm.
you have package goods companies like P&G, right? They have a lot of research. They've been doing this a long time. They know where their customers are. They're renewing that research constantly. They're working with their media agency partners hand in hand. So, you know, at that point, the creative shop really, and it's true that this has kind of been the evolution of advertising. The creative shop becomes a creative vendor, really, fulfilling an order that is being asked of them, and that's different than the Mad Men days, right? But
Mhm.
we're living in different times. In the Mad Men days, you had companies that were, you know, starting up and advertising for the first time and becoming brands. Like, really was the consumerism in America was taking off and brand was becoming important, and so it was a lot more of a wide open space. And so your media choices a lot of times will be dictated by your creative choices. Nowadays we have so much segmentation. The media is so fragmented. Even if you're, for example, if you're going to buy TikTok, the format of the video that you produce is different than when you buy on Facebook. That's not the same as with TV 30 years ago, right? Like, TV had, a 4:3 aspect ratio. Now it's
Mhm.
whatever it is now, the more letterbox style but you made one commercial and it ran on all the networks. Now you make a video, you gotta have a version for TikTok, you gotta have a version for Instagram, you gotta have a version for Facebook. So it's kind of important to know those things up front, and what you're going to be doing. And if you're not going to be using Instagram and Facebook and only TikTok, that kind of also affects things, right? Because what people go to those media for and interact with them is different, even though they're similar platforms. So I think it's just one of those things that there isn't there shouldn't be a hard and fast rule on whether deliverables need to be on the brief. I do, though. I'll go back and say I like the idea of at least hinting at what the deliverables are up front as you set the context for the brief, so that they're not in their own minds going off to do a TV production or an outdoor campaign when that's not never going to be in the cards, and we know
Yeah.
it's never going to be in the
Yeah,
cards.
I agree with you on that much. Although it is interesting that the briefs that I use to train do not discuss the deliverables, but that's because we're not privy to what the briefing was. So, for example, when we talked to Sarah about the Kiwi brief, that was an outdoor campaign. I was out of home. I'm sure that was known in advance. Now, that was the first time they'd done the campaign because they had just won the client. But I've also used a creative brief for a British agency, a London agency that was doing promotional work for the 2003 British or Summer Olympics in England, in the UK, for the BBC. So there's no doubt what the deliverables are going to be for the BBC. Everybody knows it's a broadcast and an internet company, so it's going to be TV, radio, and internet. There's no doubt about that. But I was struck by the brief because the brief simply said, we want the big idea. And that was in big, bold letters. We want the big idea. So I'm going to maintain my position that creatives should push back as often as they can to have a say in what those deliverables are above and beyond what is going to be required of them, because that's our job and it's an opportunity to make a contribution. But you make a fair point, as you always do, Henry. Good stuff, Henry.
Good stuff, Howard.
He's Henry Gomez.
And he's Howard Eibach. And together we're the Brief Brothers. Till next time.
Bye-bye.